All right, folks, here we go. Finishing up the chapter, finishing up the book. Chapter 13, kicking off with section 4 of your notes and talking about the idea of perceptions of reality. First off, let's talk about this concept. It's the cultivation theory. It suggests that the more a person is exposed to television, the more likely that the person's construction of social reality will be more like that which is shown on TV and less like reality. So you're almost kind of creating this parallel universe or second world, if you will, because you're being influenced by what you see on the screen instead of what you see in real life. Heavy TV viewing may have different outcomes for various social groups. First off, there's mainstreaming. This means that heavy viewers within social subgroups develop common perceptions that differ from those of light viewers in the same subgroup. A good way to talk about this would be in terms of news content. If you're someone that listens to a lot of conservative television or radio, and you fit within certain demographics of certain people, then it's possible that those of you in that certain demographic that watch conservative television or radio, you're going to have pretty similar points of view. Same goes for those that have a more liberal leaning and watch liberal content. Meanwhile, resonance refers to a situation in which viewers get a double dose from both TV and reality. This would be the idea that what you experience in real life and then what you watch on television somehow kind of complements what you see in real life and perhaps even kind of kicks it up a notch to make it even more real than what it is that you experience. But because you experience those things in real life, you think that those experiences are much more pronounced and much more profound than what they really are. So it appears that cultivation depends on the following. It depends on the motivation for viewing. It depends on the amount of experience with the topic, and it depends on the perceived realism of the content. First off, the motivation for viewing. Ritualistic, low involvement viewing appears to be more potent than planned and motivated viewing. So what that means is that if it's something that is content that you plan to watch, that is something that's a part of your normal routine, cultivation isn't going to happen as much because it's something that you're already intentionally seeking out. But if it's something that you happen upon it, or you only access it once in a great while, it could actually have a greater influence. Second, the amount of experience with the topic. Studies have noted that cultivation seems to work best when audience members have only indirect or distant contact with the topic. This seems to contradict the resonance notion. So here's the thought here. It's kind of the same as what we were talking about with the motivation. Is that if, say, you're not as educated on a topic or you're not as familiar with the workings of a certain issue, but you come across certain items that perhaps don't do as well as educating you, those items could have a much greater influence on you as opposed to someone that is a little more learned in a certain area and can look at things more critically, more objectively than someone that is just kind of a casual consumer of certain items. Thirdly, perceived realism of content. Cultivation appears to be enhanced when the viewer perceives the content of entertainment shows to be realistic. Can you separate what is fantasy from what is really real? Fiction from fact. That's going to play a big part of it as well. The impact of television on a person's view of social reality. Well, cultivation literature has demonstrated a weak but persistent relationship between television viewing and beliefs about the real world. So, again, it's that idea of the more that you're invested in something, the more critically you can take a look at it. But if you're more just a casual consumer, it's very possible that you could be influenced in a greater fashion one way or another by the things that you consume. In the area of racial, ethnic, and sex role stereotyping, first off, let's talk about gender. In regard to sex roles, early content analyses disclosed that men outnumbered women 2-to-1 in starring roles, and that men appeared in a far greater variety of occupational roles, especially as you're looking at content in the 50s and 60s, and even going into the 70s and 80s. We see, if we do see women, we tend to see them in certain pigeonhole sort of scenarios, like, working as a housewife or a maid or a secretary or something like that. That tends to be more gender specific of the era. And it wasn't until starting into the 70s that you start to see women taking on much more prominent roles, and that being much more pronounced. 70s and 80s kind of the same, but especially heading into the 90s and then now into the 21st century. Exposure to non-traditional content does seem to decrease sex role stereotyping, and we're seeing that a whole lot more, especially in the past 10 to 15 years or so, where we're seeing things like male nurses on the screen, or we're seeing women executives, and those sorts of things. So we're seeing the stereotyping from a gender standpoint becoming less and less and less so, although we're starting to enter another era where the question of those that don't necessarily identify themselves as male or female, or may have a transgender approach to them, that's kind of a new thing that is coming up as far as consumption of media content, and that's something that is a current struggle in society in terms of how does media portray that, and how does the public receive that. A content analysis of primetime TV programs from 2000 to 2008 found that whites made up about 80% of all characters, and African Americans about 14%, who the folks that did tend to be less and less represented would be those of Asian and Hispanic heritage. So in one sense, you do seem to have, at least as far as African Americans are concerned, pretty good proportion of the population. They're represented equally, although there is a push still for more and more minority involvement in entertainment from blacks as well as from Asians, Hispanics, and other culture groups. TV programs depicting minority characters can modify racial attitudes and perceptions. So we're seeing an ongoing theme here is that what media portray on the screen, over the air, can have a certain amount of influence in the way that we think in a culture. Now, broadcasting and politics. Let's talk about voting behavior and media's involvement there. People get a lot of political information from the media during the course of a campaign. Candidates who get extensive coverage also show strong gains in public awareness. So that goes without saying. The more exposure that a person has, whether it's in a political realm or otherwise, the more people are going to know who that person is. The pattern of news coverage during an election campaign can help determine what political issues the public perceives as important, a phenomenon known as agenda setting. So one thing that has happened in the 2020 presidential election, for example, there was a lot of emphasis on the COVID-19 crisis. There was a lot of emphasis on issues revolving around race. There's issues revolving around healthcare. But you did not hear a lot this time around about things like immigration, although it was a hot topic issue a few years ago. You did not hear a lot about foreign policy and foreign relations. You did not hear a lot about financial issues, except as they relate to COVID. So in those sort of ways, while there's a lot of different topics that can be expounded upon, many times media will concentrate on a few key issues, and it will seem like, at least in what they present, those seem to be the most important topics of the time. Voters who learn a great deal about a particular candidate are likely to vote for the candidate. Certain kinds of media exposure are also related to voter turnout. So it's that idea again. The more you know, the better that you can have an objective and critical point of view in terms of what is being presented to you in media. Now, another interesting thing here, print media readership found to be related to greater voter participation, where people who were heavy TV viewers were less likely to vote. One of the things that we can see here, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, is the way that negative advertising on TV and radio has pretty much proliferated any non-news sort of content about politics. And there is talk about whether that negative advertising is effective or not. Many times it can have a very negative effect overall, not just on thinking badly about the other candidate, but thinking about the voting process as a whole. Political campaigns have learned how to use the internet as a campaign tool. Social media has become of utmost importance these days. Debates reinforced preferences that were formed before the debates took place. We definitely saw that in the 2020 presidential election. Debates nowadays don't tend to change people's minds or to do a lot of informing about certain issues as much as they've become these rallies of sorts to kind of root on your person that is running for office. Now, the media impact on the political system. Political institutions and the media have become interdependent in a number of ways. Political reporters need information to do their jobs. Government and politicians need media exposure. So there's somewhat of a really strange bedfellow symbiotic relationship that's going on here, where they do have a certain amount of codependency on each other so that the media can get the news that they want to report and shoot for the ratings that they're looking for. Politicians looking for exposure to advance their image and their agenda. This interdependence is also demonstrated by the change in political conventions. In prior years, conventions actually selected candidates, but these days, conventions are more like coronation ceremonies, closely orchestrated to maximize primetime television coverage. Now, of course, these are the opinions of the author, but it's hard to refute what is being said here, in that most of the time, it's not so much a debate that happens within the floor of the convention as much as it is kind of a propaganda week for everyone that speaks to be able to talk about the platform of the party and in particular the platform of the presidential candidate that is being touted. Negative political advertising. Here we go. On one hand, many political consultants point to the success of several gubernatorial and senatorial elections in the 1996 campaign that relied on negative advertising and were successful. But on the other hand, several surveys and experiments have shown that negative advertising seems to make voters more cynical, less inclined to participate in political campaigns, and even less likely to vote. So, we are seeing that in the realm of political advertising, if you're concentrating so much on the idea of vote for me because the other person is bad, instead of using the opportunity to talk about your viewpoints and your issues, you might be able to create a bad taste in the mouth of voters about the other person, but are you creating a good taste about yourself? There are many that, again, in 2020, have not really talked positively about either candidate for president in 2020. And here in North Carolina, there is a sense that no one really talked positively about one or the other candidate in the senatorial race between Cal Cunningham and Tom Tillis. So, and in all those campaigns, there was a lot of negative advertising that was going on. Now, so I guess you can make your own judgment as to whether you think negative advertising in the political realm is effective or not. But I guess the question would be, to what particular end is it effective? To create positivity of a certain candidate, or just make another candidate look bad without any sort of positivity? I'll let you be the judge. Television and prosocial behavior. Some behaviors commonly defined as prosocial are learning cognitive skills associated with school achievement, cooperation, self-control, helping, sharing, resisting temptation, offering sympathy, making reparations for bad behavior. Basically all these things that we would think of as good, as proper, as moral. These sort of things is what we're talking about with prosocial learning. TV seems to have several effects on behaviors that most people would define as prosocial. Television teaches certain cognitive skills that are necessary for school success. Shows like Sesame Street and many other preschool and young elementary shows would fit into that realm. Television shows can help reduce gender-related stereotypes, and I would move that into racial stereotypes as well these days. And laboratory experiments suggest viewing commercial TV shows with definite prosocial messages can prompt subsequent prosocial behaviors, but this link has not yet been found to carry over in any significant degree to real life. So, in this case, the jury is still kind of out. So, with that in mind, the question is, how good are the commercial television shows as opposed to those that we might see on public television or that are done by some sort of a nonprofit in one way or another? Now, let's talk about new media, social impact of the internet. These days, people still by and large get their news from television. However, it is very much edged out by the internet when you combine the numbers from news websites and from social media. So the internet is pretty much taking over in terms of how people primarily get their news. Internet addiction has been linked to feelings of depression, boredom, attention deficit disorder, anxiety, alcohol use, and substance abuse. So there is that sense that the internet is becoming such that the more people spend time with it, the more they become antisocial in different ways, more reclusive, and some of these different mental issues and behavioral issues can come about. Studies seem to suggest that that internet usage by extroverts increases their overall social fingerprint, but introverts not so much. So the use of social media, how you use social media, it can provide a certain second realm, if you will, that tries its best to kind of create interconnections, and in many ways it does. But it can also kind of create kind of alter ego personalities. It can create a kind of false sense of reality. So there's still kind of this idea that, the more time you spend in front of a screen, the less social you overall become, assuming that social means actual physical interaction with others. Looking ahead into the future, new technology is expensive and may increase the distance between the media, the media haves rather, and the media have-nots. Although technology is becoming more and more affordable, as long as you don't have to have the latest and greatest, the stuff that's 10 years old is very cheap, and if you can get connected, is very still accessible to a lot of information and entertainment. Personal and financial privacy is becoming more and more of an issue to combat as hackers try to steal your personal data, try to become an imposter with your name, your bank account information, your social security information. And while the safeguards are being developed, there's still a lot of problems out there. Information overload, the feeling of confusion and helplessness that occurs when a person is confronted with too much stimulation in a limited time period. We know way too much about things that we would have never even thought about thinking about 20 and 30 years ago. The whole idea of our brain exploding, well, at least figuratively, it very much could become a thing. And finally, more couch potatoes, moving away from personal interaction, kind of becoming introverts and recluses, instead of knowing what it's like to go out and be in the physical presence of somebody. If you've ever seen the meme online that says, introverts, unite separately in your own homes. That's kind of the idea here. And is that a good thing for us to see evolving? And if we don't think so, what do we do about it? So, various questions, more things to study, more things to ponder about as we move on in the world of broadcasting and communications. But for us, that's it. So, finish up those notes and study questions, get them turned in, participate in the online discussion board on Blackboard, and make sure you're watching Cougar Mail and Blackboard for any updates and changes, other things you need to know. But folks, we've finished the book. As far as that goes, we're done. Congratulations.